Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, live in Los Angeles with James Jacob Prasch via Skype, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. Wonderful to be with you, and what a week in prophecy it has indeed been. We might call this week the countdown to nothing. The countdown to nothing. In less than 48 hours, it'll be the 23rd of September, where the charlatan promoters of the misinterpretation of Revelation chapter 12, Virgo, etc., will be debunked as frauds, Mr. Tapley and co. He will go the way of Mark Biltz, he will go the way of Harold Camping, of the Y2K scaremongers, etc., having done their damage to the body of Christ, and once again having discredited the church in the service of Satan. So that when something of true prophetic significance takes place, people will just think it's another boy that cried wolf scenario, courtesy of these con artists, naive practitioners of mysticism that they imagine to be Christianity when it's simply pseudo-spiritual religiosity, hangers-on, and general promulgators of nonsense. Hyper-charismatics, gospel in the stars advocates, etc., etc. It is all nonsense and will be proven to be nonsense. We would refer you to the excellent article authored by Scott Pruitt, available on the Moriel website and our Facebook page, which does a fairly comprehensive theological treatise reviewing the historical origins of the kind of thinking that has led up to this crackpot nonsense. Scott Pruitt has done an excellent article. In any event, nothing is going to happen, and we have less than 48 hours until the event. Since I've spoken to you, though, it has been Rosh Hashanah, and as the rabbis count time, it is now the Jewish year of 5778. So they say. Of course, Rosh Hashanah scripturally is not New Year. The first of Nisan in the spring was the New Year, ordained by Torah. The rabbis changed the meaning of what was known as Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, or the Feast of the Blowing of the Trumpets, with the Baal Tekoah. It has a very different meaning. And that meaning in Scripture is a meaning of warning, of impending catastrophic events. And so we see these events. Once again, there's always been earthquakes. There have always been hurricanes. But as always, the intensity and the frequency are increasing since records of such things have been kept. A series of hurricanes. Hurricane Irma, certainly the damage that was done to Houston, affecting the oil industry. But now we have Hurricane Marie following it, absolutely Category 4, hitting full force, demolishing Puerto Rico's infrastructure in terms of public utilities. Please pray for Puerto Rico. It will take a very long time to see a recovery of the infrastructure of Puerto Rico. It will be very difficult for the people of Puerto Rico, who are already in an economically depressed situation. It is not good for Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. Those people need prayer. Nonetheless, it's the frequency about which these things are happening, one after another. The same can be said for the new earthquake in Mexico City, with fatalities now over 1,000, following another earthquake that happened even more recently when I was in Argentina. Again, it is the frequency at which these are occurring, and they're becoming increasingly higher on the Richter scale. But Jesus told us these things are the beginning of birth pangs. The beginning of birth pangs. This week in prophecy, the world was captivated by the dynamic speech delivered by President Donald Trump to the United Nations. He spoke directly and blatantly about a number of issues.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. Strong, sovereign nations let diverse countries with different values, different cultures, and different dreams not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. The greatest in the United States Constitution is its first 3 beautiful words. They are, "We the people." In America, the people govern, the people rule, and the people are sovereign.
Shep, good afternoon to you. And one of the outer rain bands, by the way, of Hurricane Jose just moving in here to New York City. The president on the now slick streets of New York left the United Nations just a short time ago, heading back to his hotel, but not before he gave a toast at the traditional luncheon held by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He is the new UN Secretary General, at which the president said the United Nations has potential that is unlimited and that he wants to see the United Nations do something epic. And the epic thing that he would like to see the United Nations do in the immediate term is to put the screws to North Korea to get it to give up its nuclear program. You played just before the break there the very strident language that the president had, saying that they would destroy North Korea if it came to that, if North Korea were to threaten the United States' territories or its allies. But the president prefers a diplomatic option. Listen to what he told the UN General Assembly earlier today.
It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more.
You heard Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, say late last week that the president in his speech was going to slap the right people and hug the right people. He slapped North Korea, he slapped Iran, he hugged China and Russia, saying thanks for helping out with those UN sanctions. So far, Shep, no reaction yet from North Korea.
What about other world leaders, John?
We're hearing a varied response. First of all, from Benjamin Netanyahu, who the president met with yesterday, and they have forged quite a close relationship, saying, quote, in over 30 years in my experience with the United Nations, I never heard a bolder or more courageous speech. President Trump spoke the truth about the great dangers facing our world and issued a powerful call to confront them in order to ensure the future of humanity. The foreign minister from Iran, on the other hand, after the president called out Iran, and you said, as you pointed out, Shep, said that the Iran nuclear deal was an embarrassment to the United States, Javad Zarif tweeting out, quote, Trump's ignorant hate speech belongs in medieval times, not the 21st century, unworthy of a reply. Though I guess you could say that that tweet constituted a reply. Fake empathy for Iranians fools no one. And after the president called out the Maduro regime in Venezuela, Jorge Arraza, who was the foreign minister, had this to say about the president.
We do not accept threats from President Trump or whomever in this world. This racist and supremacist theory which he is exponing, this return to the Cold War. For a moment, we didn't know if we were listening to President Reagan in 1982 or to President Trump in 2017.
Didn't know whether we were listening to President Reagan or President Trump. Well, clearly the times were different back in '82. The Cold War was still going on. But, Shep, to liken President Trump to Ronald Reagan as an insult, I think would be a little backwards. I think he would take that as a compliment.
I'm guessing he would, John. The president also spoke about the global challenge of terrorism.
Yeah, and very similar to the address that he gave when he was speaking to the Arab and other Muslim nations in Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago. The president reached out to the United Nations and said, you've got to band together to fight this common enemy in the form of terrorism against ISIS, against al-Qaeda. Here's what the president said.
The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people.
And as he did during his NATO speech during that same international trip, he reached out to member nations of the United Nations to do more to pay and pull their fair share when it came to military and financial obligations. Listen here.
The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else.
The president pointing out that the United States funds 23% of UN operations, saying it's time for other nations to do its share, to do their share, pointing out that Americans have made the ultimate sacrifice for the United Nations, and that America's devotion to the United Nations and to global peace and stability has been measured on the battlefield.
Of course, he received an avalanche of criticism from the left, from the Democratic Party, from his political opponents, from the same people whose policies of appeasement and placating North Korea are responsible for the mess that President Trump has inherited, dating back to Harry S. Truman. Yet the very people responsible for kicking the can down the road are now blaming him for the fact that there's no more road to kick the can down.
President Trump was at the UN this morning, and he gave what was, by virtually all accounts, a very good speech. A lot of people on the left are very upset because he was too mean to Iran and North Korea. He was too militant. How dare he be mean to these countries? Dianne Feinstein sent out the senator from California. She sent out a note saying that it was just terrible. How could President Trump do such a thing? She complained that he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. She said, "The goals of the United Nations are to foster peace and promote global cooperation. Today, the president used it as a stage to threaten war. He missed an opportunity to present any positive action the UN could take with respect to North Korea, and he launched a diatribe against Iran, again offering no pathway forward." Okay, a couple of things about this. Number one, the Trump administration was responsible for a unanimous resolution in the UN Security Council levying more sanctions on North Korea. So Trump has done more with the UN on North Korea than Obama ever did. And with regard to Iran, it is the Iran deal that has allowed the Iranians to gain power in the region. It's the Iran deal where President Obama sent literally pallets of cash, like tens of millions of dollars, pallets of cash, to the Iranian regime, which were then funneled toward terrorism, and gave them a pathway, a legal pathway to a nuclear weapon in 10 years or less. And Dianne Feinstein is ripping Trump over all of this. She says by suggesting he would revisit and possibly cancel the Iran nuclear agreement, he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. No, actually, it's the Iran nuclear agreement that essentially has made it clear to North Korea that they should continue to pursue a nuclear weapon, because once you get close enough to a nuclear weapon, then no one will attack you ever again. Right? What nation would negotiate with the United States when the agreements we reach with other countries are so easily undermined? We reached a negotiation with the North Koreans during the Clinton administration. Dianne Feinstein should know, she was still Senator of California at the time, and it didn't make any difference. They developed a nuclear weapon anyway. So the Democrats are fighting mad, and they've been forced into the awkward position of now having to defend some of the worst people on planet Earth. So President Trump at the UN today gave what was a very interventionist speech. I mean, people are portraying this as a realist speech, but this is not really a realist speech, okay? What he was talking about today, he said things like, we don't want to intervene and change other people's systems for them. That's not our goal. But then he talked about Venezuela, and he suggested properly that they need to return to some sort of democratic rule in Venezuela. Well, if you're a hardcore realist, like a Rand Paul realist and a non-interventionist, you'd say, what does Venezuela have to do with us? Okay, so they're oppressing their own people. Okay, so their people are starving en masse. What does that have to do with us? The reality is the vast majority of Americans, as realist as we consider ourselves, still have a moral spine to what we believe about foreign policy. And that doesn't mean we can afford to be the world's policeman or that we should intervene everywhere. It does mean that when we see egregious abuses like in Venezuela, that the U.S. does consider action because the American people generally demand such action. We generally do. Now, a big problem is the American people don't then have patience for such action very often, but the fact that we actually care about Venezuela demonstrates that this is not a hardcore realist America First administration. You can be America First and still pursue America's goals, because one of our goals is the fomenting of democracy and liberalism, like old school classical liberalism, around the world. Again, that doesn't mean military overthrow. Sometimes that means sanctions. Sometimes that means diplomacy. But the idea that Trump is a non-interventionist, I think that didn't survive this speech today. So President Trump starts off by ripping into Venezuela and talking about socialism in Venezuela is pretty spectacular. It's clip 14.
The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented.
Okay. And you hear total silence in the room. And finally, there's a little bit of applause. I like Trump just staring out at them, all the socialist countries who have been imbibing this nonsense for a while. And what he says here is exactly right. This is what I have said for a long time. It's not about socialism being a great idea misapplied. It's about a bad idea being applied properly. Every place that socialism is tried to its full capacity, it leads to massive amounts of human suffering, death, and starvation. So good for Trump on this. Trump also suggested that the world has a moral responsibility to side against aggressors. Here's President Trump talking about Iran and saying that we have to confront evil or evil will triumph.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea.
Good for him. Okay, well, what he's talking about here is exactly correct. This is a far cry from President Obama, who went in front of the United Nations virtually every year and then whined about how the United States was responsible for all the world's ills. He would go up there and he would talk about how America in the past had been too braggadocious. How we, in the past, we've been too interventionist. It's been our fault. We've made people angry. We've been too arrogant. None of that from President Trump. Good for President Trump. I mean, all this is good. The fact is that we're going to need to see some actual hard policy backing the words. You know, how far is he willing to go? What is he willing to do? That's always the question, right? It's always the Sean Connery question from The Untouchables. What are you willing to do? That's always the big question in foreign policy. And we don't really have a clear answer from President Trump on that. But I know one thing he's not willing to do, and that is apologize for the U.S.'s presence on the world stage. And that's a very good thing. That's very, and it's reassuring, because the truth is that in the past, President Trump has made sort of Ron Paulian comments about the role of the United States in the world. You remember just a few months ago, he was talking about how the U.S. has killed people like Vladimir Putin. And one of the criticisms that I think is actually not unfair of this speech is that Trump nowhere in the speech mentioned Russia, and Russia's aggression continues. And I think that's perfectly appropriate to point out that President Trump should have mentioned Russia. And that's one critique. The other critique of his speech is this line that he dropped halfway through that is totally Trumpian, where he's talking about North Korea and he just decides to drop an Elton John song in the middle of his speech about North Korea. Here's what he had to say.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. He's just reading straight from his Twitter feed now. I think it's going to be a long, long time until touchdown brings me around again, man. Apparently, the North Korean delegation walked out. Apparently, they were not here for this. They said they let a junior diplomat sit in. They packed their bags last night, pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. So that's, yeah, again, like, I don't understand what the purpose of the Rocket Man thing is. Like, it's funny, but it also undercuts the seriousness of the situation. I mean, imagine, I saw there's a great tweet today about this. I do love that there's somebody who tweeted out about, Ronald Reagan, suggesting that Ronald Reagan should have gone to Brandenburg Gate and said, well, birthmark kid, tear down this wall. Might not have had quite the same impact if he had said that to Mikhail Gorbachev. So I'm not sure what the purpose is of this. It is funny. It is funny. The media are jumping on it, and they are suggesting that this demonstrates that he's not serious, suggesting that he is obviously stupid, and that's why he did all of this. He's Trump, and that's why he did all of this. But, how serious he is about North Korea, well, we're going to find out. We're going to find out, because I don't think North Korea is going to stop this sort of activity. I really don't. It is amazing to watch, however, the media go completely nuts over this speech as though he said something wildly different. Now, here's the thing that's funny. The left is going crazy over this speech because they're suggesting that President Obama never would have been so confrontational. He never would have done anything like this. President Obama launched a virtually useless and counterproductive war in Libya. President Obama signed off on the Iran deal. President Obama did nothing about North Korea. And he used to go there and talk consistently about human rights. President Trump doesn't like talking about human rights very much. But when he goes to the UN, what he is saying is more conducive to human rights than what President Obama said. A niceness on the world stage does not equal the promulgation of human rights. It doesn't equal the spread of human rights. American strength on the world stage equals the spread of human rights around the world. It doesn't mean we're always right. It doesn't mean everything we do is good. It doesn't mean every choice we make is the right one. But it does mean that a stronger America is a freer world, and a weaker America is a less free world. And even President Trump, who sort of began this campaign as an anti-interventionist, the Iraq War was evil and conspiratorial, all of this, he's moved beyond that now, as all presidents do, okay? There's a general foreign policy consensus, no matter how much we wish to buck it. Obama was the first one really to try to buck it, that says that America needs to be strong on the world stage because otherwise the world becomes a worse place. I think Trump understands that, and good for him.
Hypocrisy of Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, and the mainstream media, the very people who were supportive of the policies, the failed policies of the Clinton administration, of Jimmy Carter's inept negotiation, where America and the West gave $5 billion in aid to North Korea and built them a nuclear reactor. We see the result. And now Mr. Trump is being criticized for simply stating the facts and warning that things have come to a head. I personally would like to see America shoot down any further missile launches by North Korea, and I would like to see America begin shooting missiles of its own, submarine launched, over North Korea into the Sea of Japan. But what's going to be effective is if the United States, Japan, and South Korea put a trade embargo on China and Russia. It would be a dramatic and dire effort. It would have an extreme impact on the global economy. But the situation being faced in Korea is that serious. It is that serious when you have a madman, developing these kinds of missiles with a nuclear delivery capability. A trade embargo on Russia and on any European or other companies doing business with Russia or China being banned from doing business in the United States, Japan, or South Korea. You will see Russia and China remove that crazy despot very quickly. There is what to do without resorting to warfare, although that option must be kept on the table. Once again, we urge prayers for Mr. Trump that he will keep his word, but he spoke forcefully about Iran this week in prophecy in his UN speech. More of that in a moment. This week in prophecy, September 7th, the Israelis attacked a chemical and biological manufacturing facility run by Iran in Syria. 10 years to the day after Israel destroyed a nuclear reactor under construction with the assistance of North Korea inside Syria. Israel has been the only country to take direct military action against the pro-terrorist exploits of North Korea outside of North Korea. And it was commemorated with another airstrike on September 7th, attacking an Iranian manufacturing facility for weapons of mass destruction in Syria. I do believe a situation can and will emerge when ISIS is completely obliterated for America, Israel, and other countries in the Middle East to begin attacking Iranian targets in Syria and in Iraq. This would be the best course of action, possibly. I believe it would be. But again, we're not a political advocacy ministry. That's not our purpose as a ministry. Our purpose as a ministry is to look at the prophetic significance of these events. Last week we reported about the most recent Islamic terrorist attack on the London Tube, the London subway system at Parsons Green. We found that the British police raided the home, the foster home of one of the bombers. A British couple, honored by the Queen with MBEs, members of the British Empire. It's a royal honor given annually for fostering children, were raided by the police, and they found explosive devices for the use of making weapons of terror to be used against the civilian population of London. These Muslims were taken in and fostered by British families. They were shown kindness and charity by the people of Britain. This proves what I've been saying consistently. Fundamentalist Islam, radical Islam, Islamists look upon kindness and charity as weakness. When you take care of them, when you help them, when you give them charity, they see it as their due. They see it as demitude. They see it as the infidel needing to pay them a penalty for not being a Muslim. There is no gratitude. They will take your charity and then kill you because that is the teaching of their religion. Not that all Muslims interpret it that way. Some don't. But the fundamentalist Islamists do. The liberal do-gooders who talk about charity and being kind to these people, and they're doing it because of the way they've been treated. This is nonsense. This week in prophecy, we speak a lot about Islamists and radical Muslims, Now let's speak about moderate ones in the same breath. The King of Bahrain and the Bahrainian government and the Bahrainian parliament, which is semi-democratic, has taken a concrete action, saying it is okay for its citizens to visit Israel, and they may give visas to Israelis to visit Bahrain. And a series of riots orchestrated by outside Palestinian Arab Muslim sources in 1947 and in 1967, the traditional Jewish community of Bahrain was largely driven out, with only a handful of Jews left in Bahrain. But now the King of Bahrain has said enough is enough. He okayed visits to Israel. And he has appointed a Jewish woman to a diplomatic position to the Bahrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. This indeed sets a precedent. But he goes further. The Bahrainian government and its king has stated the boycott of Israel is bad. It is ethically bad. It is unethical, and it is not in the interest of the Arab nations to do so. He held a public event where a declaration of religious tolerance was signed and announced he would open a museum of religious freedom. He invited a number of dignitaries and officials to attend, including Rabbi Marvin Hayir from the United States. At this event, the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the USA, was played, as was Hatikva, the National Military Orchestra of Bahrain, Arab Muslim, played Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, as the boycott of Israel was denounced by the King of Bahrain, and as he gave an okay for his citizens to visit Israel. He's appointed a Jewish woman to a diplomatic position in the USA. We must be careful. Some of the United Emirates, the government of Mr. Sisi in Egypt, although I do not believe in Islam, a distinction must be made between people like this, between General Sisi, between the government of Bahrain and the fundamentalist Islamists. They are not the same. Now, what is conspicuous is that many of these moderate Islamic regimes are opposed to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood that was supported, in effect, by the Obama administration. Quite a situation. This week in prophecy. Now, we understand something. There will be an ultimate reconciliation between Jew and Arab when Jesus comes. We deal about this in our teaching on Jewish-Arab reconciliation in Christ, available on our websites and so forth. As Jacob was reconciled to Esau, one day Jew and Arab will be reconciled in Jesus, fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah chapter 19, etc. In the meantime, however, we know that the Antichrist will also bring a false peace between Jew and Arab to the Middle East. And we cannot help but view these events in that light. Watch this space. This has been an important and a significant development this week in prophecy. Moving on again to Iran and relating it to President Trump's speech and President Trump's meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu's own address to the United Nations. A top Iranian general, Abed Raham Musawi, the one who stated that Israel will no longer exist in 25 years, has now stated this week in prophecy that this destruction of Israel could come sooner if Israel does not keep quiet about the Barack Obama, John Kerry peace deal concerning the development of nuclear weapons by Iran, in which Iran was given the green light to continue nuclear development without meaningful inspection. Given the right to continue to develop delivery systems in the form of missiles that can reach Israel. It was announced this week that Iran now has a targeted missile with good accuracy capable of hitting Tel Aviv. Now this general is saying if Israel doesn't keep quiet about the Iranian deal of Barack Obama and John Kerry, the 25 years to live sentence could be moved forward. These people are serious, and we must be serious. It was the Obama administration that additionally unfroze $150 billion in funds to allow Iran to continue to fund terror to kill Americans in Afghanistan and in Iraq, among others. If there was ever a president who should have been impeached, it was certainly Barack Obama. But the media, of course, said nothing. Meanwhile, the State Department, Mr. Tillerson, as usual, a man who we do not like, has been backed down by the White House in his demand that $75 million approved by Congress in aid to Israel be returned. The opposition was led by Senator Tom Cotton. The State Department, no matter who runs it, has never been a friend of Israel and is no friend of Israel under the Trump administration. It is run by the Council of Foreign Relations membership largely, and we have long called for it to be hollowed out. A house cleaning is needed. People speak of draining the swamp. The swamp will never be drained unless there is judicial reform and judges who legislate from the bench, including Mr. Roberts, are removed. There will never be a draining of the swamp unless the Federal Reserve is abolished. There will never be a draining of the swamp unless the State Department is cleaned out. There will never be a draining of the swamp unless term limits are set for politicians in the House and Senate. We are seeing this week further strangulation by rhinocrats, Democrats in the Republican Party, like Susan Collins, again trying to preserve Obamacare after the Republicans were elected with a mandate from the public to get rid of Obamacare. We see this with John McCain, with Senator Murkowski, above all Susan Collins, and of course we can continue to thank Mitch McConnell, House Speaker Ryan, and his predecessor John Boehner. The rhinocrats, the Democrats who sit on the opposite side of the aisle, strangling the agenda of President Trump. Again, he is not perfect, and we do not agree with everything he says or everything he does. But we do want to see the swamp drained, and it's not being drained very effectively. But let us move on. This week in prophecy. One of the mistakes we feel the Trump administration is making is its position announced during the UN sessions to intervene in the situation in Burma, where the Rohingya, the Islamic tribal people of southern Burma, that are being driven out in response to the militant Islamic actions of the Rohingya Salvation Army, a Sunni Islamic radical militia, essentially Islamic terrorist organization, have prompted a response from Burma and the Burmese military with the backing of most of the Burmese public who are Buddhist. Again, we have often been concerned with the plight of Christians in Burma. Yet, the situation in southern Burma needs to be understood as what happened in the former Yugoslavia, where the Kosovo Liberation Army, an Islamic organ associated with Al-Qaeda, provoked the trouble that brought about a U.S. intervention on behalf of the Muslims against the Serbs. There were plenty of culpable individuals in the Serb, the Croat, and in the Bosnian communities. Nobody was completely innocent. But the essential situation is a centuries-old history of Islamic aggression going back before the Ottoman Turks. It was the Kosovo Liberation Army who provoked the situation that took place in Srebrenica and these other disasters in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and so forth. Yet the Clinton administration, in a criminal act, in league with Tony Blair, Javier Solano, and Wesley Clark, commander of NATO, illegally bombed the Serbs. The NATO Charter said NATO cannot attack any country that does not attack a NATO country. There was no legal mandate to do it under international law. But to placate Islam, the Clintons and Tony Blair did it. Well, we saw what happened. The Kosovo Liberation Army, their cousins, Al-Qaeda, attacked America September 11th. Whenever you intervene on behalf of the Muslims, they knife you in the back when they are fundamentalist Muslims. And now we have another Islamic terrorist militia, the Salvation Army, as they call themselves. 370,000 Rohingya have been driven out of southern Burma into Bangladesh. That is where they belong. We commend the actions of the Burmese military and government in driving this Islamic element out of their country. It followed the rape and murder in 2012 of a Myanmar citizen by Muslims. This is typical anywhere from Sweden to North Africa. The gang raping of infidel women, as they call them. This provokes a reaction. Again, the human rights record and the civil rights record of the Burmese government has not been good. But we understand why they are doing what they are doing. In driving the Rohingya out, they're protecting their country from radical Islam. Are all the Rohingya people sympathetic to the Rohingya Salvation Army? I don't know, but many indeed are. The only way to guarantee peace for both communities is for the Rohingya to go to an Islamic country, which is Bangladesh, where they belong. Meanwhile, however, we see international criticism against Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel laureate, who herself had been a house prisoner held by the Burmese government before the more recent reforms. She only heads the civilian government of Burma. She does not control the military. But she's being pressured to speak up and act on behalf of the Rohingya. She has not done so. She said it is politically untenable because of the widespread support of the Buddhist community for what the military is doing in response to the rapes and murders by the Muslim gangs. And so it goes. Some have called for her to have her Nobel Prize withdrawn. Among those pressuring her are, of course, Bishop Desmond Tutu and others. This week in prophecy, something that Mr. Trump called dumb correctly. The transfer of Islamic refugees from Australia, who the Australians did not want to accept, are to come to America because of the Obama administration. The Australians did not want them, so Obama decided they should come to the USA. Inheriting and stuck with the deal, the first 50 are due to arrive this week. There is a total of 1,200. They're being kept offshore, not in Australia, but in Papua New Guinea and the Isle of Nanaimo. Australian Immigration Minister Peter Dutton announced that the first 50 would be transferred. These people are walking distance from the world's largest Islamic country that is increasingly Islamizing. That is Indonesia. Brunei is an oil-rich Islamic state with Sharia that persecutes Christians. It owns the Beverly Hills Hotel and it owns the Bel Air Hotel, the Dorchester Hotel in London, etc. Why does the Sultan of Brunei not fund the care of these Muslims and bring them to Brunei or at least to Indonesia? Why must they come to Australia? And more absurdly, why bring them all the way to the United States? They don't belong in the United States. They belong in the Islamic country, walking distance from where they're presently situated. I wish Mr. Trump would keep his word. I realize there's politics and diplomacy involved, but they don't belong in America. They don't belong in any civilized country. They belong in a country with Sharia, like Brunei, that is not civilized. I've been there. I saw people living on stilts, in huts built over raw sewage in the lagoons, while the Sultan lives in golden palatial environs like you wouldn't believe. Let him take these people in. That's their religion, that's their culture. Why must they come to the West? This week in prophecy, they're beginning to arrive because of the deal negotiated by Barack Obama and which Mr. Trump has not reversed, unfortunately. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy. The Palestinian Authority is teaching its extreme hatred towards Jews and incentivizing terrorist attacks, while the U.S. taxpayer continues to send hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority. The Trump administration has announced its strong support for the Taylor Force Act, a bill that restricts U.S. economic aid to the West Bank and Gaza until the Palestinian Authority stops paying terrorists guilty of violence against the Israelis and Americans. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump has yet to keep his promise to move the embassy. I hope he keeps his promise to support this legislation. Why are we giving hundreds of millions of dollars of our money to incentivize Islamic terror, be it in Israel or anywhere else? This week in prophecy, 24 Israeli mayors representing nearly 500,000 residents of the West Bank sent a letter to Senator Tom Cotton asking him to encourage U.S. senators to pass the Taylor Force Act. We stand by this legislation, and we urge that it be passed. The fact is, the indigenous people of the West Bank, according to the archaeological record that confirms the biblical and historical record, are the Jews, not the Muslims. I do not object to the Muslims living there. They live there peaceably, but there has never been a so-called Palestinian state on that turf. Never has been. They are not the indigenous people. Anything that restricts the right of Jews to live there is like restricting the right of Apaches to live in Arizona. But let's move on to looking at what many people have been infatuated with, Ezekiel 38 and 39 beginning to take shape. Many believe there will be a Gog and Magog scenario apart from the one at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. In other words, another one that will be pre-millennial as well as the post-millennial one. Seeing the rebirth of Israel in Ezekiel 37 with the dry bones as setting the stage for that to happen. The key player in this, of course, must be the ancient land of the Hittites. It must be Turkey. We've been warning about Turkey's leader, Erdogan, for many, many months. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been at it again this week in prophecy. He tried to censor an American think tank from speaking out about the brutal attack, the assault on peaceful demonstrators outside the Turkish ambassador's residence in Washington, D.C., and to depress media coverage the way he does in Turkey. He was unable to do that in the United States the way he does in Turkey, but it wasn't for lack of trying.
Following an oddly chummy meeting between President Trump and President Erdogan of Turkey, Erdogan's bodyguards were actually caught on video brawling with protesters. So it's dramatic footage. We're gonna give you all the details. We wanna go to this now. Take a look at what was captured.
Back you! Back you across the street! Get over there! Get over behind! Get over! Don't talk! Stay!
You fit that the gospel! Yeah, take to me! I wasn't the son!
One 14-cent olive oil.
Don't move.
Get back!
They attacked this man. You saw him. You came right after him.
Hey, go! No, get over there! Hey! Say, get back over there! Hey, you got to get out. I got you back over there. Hey! You go back out there! Come on, get across the street. Okay. Get across the street. Get across the street.
Out of the street. To the curb.
Okay, so that's dramatic footage. Let's break down what you were seeing there. So according to witnesses, the brawl erupted when his security detail, this is the president of Turkey's security detail, attacked protesters carrying the flag of the Kurdish PYD party outside the ambassador's residence in DC. A local NBC television affiliate reported that Erdogan was inside that building at the time. Metropolitan Police Department spokesman Dustin Sternbeck said 2 people were arrested, including one who was charged with assaulting a police officer. And we believe that in the earlier portion of that video, you saw a gentleman on the ground being kicked twice in the head by people in suits. It seems like those were probably the security officials.
Yes.
Now, apparently, the scuffle started when supporters of Erdogan and protesters began to fight. The guards then went outside and immediately attacked the protesters on behalf of the supporters of Erdogan.
Okay, so let's break it down further. So the guys in the suits are the Turkish security guards. You see on the tape, you can see it with your own eyes there. They're charging at the protesters. Now, what we don't see on tape is who started in the first place.
Yeah.
Kurdish side, Turkish side. I don't know, and honestly, I don't care for the purpose of this story because we're not talking about the protesters here. If the protesters, one side attacked the other, that's an assault issue that the Washington D.C. can deal with, etc. What are the Turkish security guards doing getting in the middle of a fight? And to the point where the American police have to separate them from the protesters, and while they're separating him, as you just saw there, they viciously kicked that guy in the head, let alone all the other attacks. It's embarrassing. So now I'll tell you my guess as to why they did it. So that Kurdish flag they think represents terrorism. So they think the Kurdish separatists, whether they're in Syria or in Turkey, are terrorists that are fighting against Turkey, so they get upset, and any attack on a fellow Turk is considered the worst thing in the world. So if they see people flying that flag and they see them attacking Turkish-Americans on the side of the road, they think, okay, let's go bum rush them. No, you can't bum rush them. You can't do that in the middle of America. You can't attack and punch and kick protesters in America.
Yeah.
Now, I know that Erdogan's bodyguards have gotten away in Turkey with doing a lot of that. And
a lot worse.
Yes, and we've seen the videos of them assaulting protesters in Turkey. But this isn't Turkey, this is America. So that's not what we do here. And so at a bare minimum, what they're doing is deeply embarrassing Turkey, because now people think, okay, what's Turkey? A bunch of thugs come in and start attacking protesters.
Yeah.
That's not a good look, okay? Yeah. And second of all, just understand the concept, man. And that's the essence of the problem for Erdogan's government, which is if I disagree with you, it doesn't mean you should kick my ass.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they've built up a lot of power using intimidation tactics just like this. So a tiger doesn't change his stripes. They come here and they think, who cares? Let's just do the same thing. We can get away with it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have one more photo if we can actually showing one of the suspected security guards choking a woman there. Yeah, and look, anyone who resorts so easily to violence, it's awful. But when you hold all of the power and you believe that violence should be the first go-to, you see protesters. This is America. You're allowed to protest, okay? To go out there and immediately begin assaulting people, kicking women in the face on the ground. There's many photos going around of women, just blood streaming down their faces. Now, as we said with the MP's statement, we don't know exactly how many arrests there were. A statement was put out by the State Department earlier today, a tweet from Julie Davis saying, "We are communicating our concern to the Turkish government in the strongest possible terms." Great.
Oh, wow.
I guess that's
it has been
something. And it came out slightly before we went live today that the State Department is actually working right now to ID the individual security guards identified in the footage, but they don't currently know who they are. And we don't know if they do identify them, what will actually be done. But understand that in the background of all this, Erdogan visits, meets with Trump. If there was one word critical of the Turkish regime and what they've done, especially recently in Turkey, I have heard nothing about it. And this is a regime, this is a president who still has thousands of journalists, police officers, judges, civil servants of various sorts in jail right now. Journalists in jail, some journalists have been killed very recently in Turkey. And to have him here and to say not a single critical word, not standing up for any of the values that we supposedly represent as a country, is at least as offensive as the assaults we just witnessed.
But why would Trump do that? He probably looks up to Erdogan.
He's spoken very favorably about him in the past. So he congratulated him on the win of the referendum not too long ago.
So we just found out that he asked James Comey to imprison reporters who covered leaks coming from the Trump White House. So as he looks at Erdogan, who's imprisoned all those journalists in Turkey, he probably thinks, wow, that's so great. I wish I could be like this guy. And then a power grab that Erdogan did to make him far more powerful and basically get rid of the old ways. You can't really argue with that. It definitely got rid of the old system in Turkey, which had more diffused power and centralized that power at the top. Trump thinks that sounds wonderful. He probably took notes like, hey, Erdogan, you're at least smart. I'm not that bright. Can you tell me how to be more authoritarian? And Erdogan's like, no, I could do one better. Look at what my guards are about to do. Okay, so I hope that Trump was not taking notes. Look, it's one thing that if Turks are of course upset about Kurdish terrorism and they're worried about Americans arming Kurds in Syria and where those weapons might go, if they're concerned about Fethullah Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania, might or might not have organized a coup against Erdogan, well, I think those are legitimate concerns.
Now American Islamists are turning to Ankara. They're turning to his regime. In more recent years, the Muslim Brotherhood has found a friend in Ankara. At the same time, even Saudi Arabia and much more, Egypt and the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, are turning away from the Muslim Brotherhood or have turned away from it. Turkey is welcoming it with open arms, making gestures of support more common and more dangerous. This is his government. Ahmed Shahata, a lobbyist for the Muslim Brotherhood, who's worked for Islamic Relief and the Muslim American Society and two prominent Islamist groups, designated as terrorist organizations by the United Arab Emirates, have a great friend in the Turkish government. Now again, understand, we must make this distinction between moderate Muslims and radicals. It is the Emirates who are calling the Muslim Brotherhood dangerous terrorists. But the United States has given platform to this creature, Ahmed Shahata. Why? But it's happening this week in prophecy, and diplomatic relations with Turkey, which has ramifications for American policy in Syria and Iraq, is obviously a component in the calculation. But Turkey has pulled further away from NATO this week. It announced the purchase of the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile system. It is a combination of an anti-aircraft missile system and a version of missile tracking that would be analogous to the American Aegis system. Some would say that it is the most advanced anti-aircraft system in the world. That is debated. The Israelis and the Americans, we do not know what their capabilities actually are, but the S-400 is being certainly marketed as the most advanced, and it may be. It has a range of about 300 miles, nearly 300 miles, perhaps 280 to 290 miles, and it can take down as many as 80 targets at the same time. This is incredible high performance if it can hold up to that in actual combat scenarios. Now, we know that the Russians have made these kinds of claims before about their hardware, but in actual battlefield scenarios, it has not worked. The test lab has often been the Middle East, where American technology, much of it airborne, mounted on F-15s and F-16s, flown by Israeli pilots, would test the capabilities of such Russian-manufactured hardware in the hands of Islamic countries. And very often, the Russian claims as to the performance standards of their hardware have not been what the Russians have claimed. They've been good, but not that good. We are not sure. Nonetheless, the S-400 is still a formidable challenge to the West, certainly to America, to NATO, and to Israel. Turkey is buying it and has already begun making payments. This week in prophecy, something is happening. The Kurdish government is voting in public referendum for an independence movement in northern Iraq. This would greatly trouble Turkey. There are 20 million Kurds. They've been badly treated by the Kurds, badly treated by Muslim Arabs, badly treated by the Iranians. And as I've said, they are the descendants of the ancient Medes. They're the only people in the quagmire of Iraq who the West can to any degree trust. But they are pushing for independence, realizing that there can be no peace in league with either Sunni or Shia Islam, or Sunni or Shia governments in Iraq or Syria. This has irked Turkey because of the high Kurdish population inside Turkey that is demanding independence in its areas from the Turkish government.
On April 16th, Turkey narrowly voted yes on a referendum that will dramatically reorganize the government. It allows changes that give sweeping powers to the president, Tayyip Erdogan. He could have complete control of Turkey's budget and military, will be able to appoint judges to the courts without a vote, can dissolve parliament whenever he chooses, and can stay in power until 2029. This has prompted concerns that he's becoming too authoritarian. And these concerns aren't that outlandish, mostly because Turkey was built by an authoritarian.
If you look at the arc of modern Turkish history, it begins with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk.
First president of the First Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal, during the 1920s, is now granted dictatorial powers and is himself christened Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks.
Ataturk was a military general who created the Republic of Turkey out of the collapsed Ottoman Empire in 1923. During his 15 years in office, he enjoyed similar powers now held by Erdogan. He used them to build Turkey into a modern and secular state.
Turkey's new government separates church and state.
So he banned head coverings.
To Kemal, this headgear, the fez, symbolizes Turkey's Oriental fatalism and ignorance. He will abolish it.
He put mosques under state control.
Islamic traditions are shattered.
He made it basically illegal to discriminate against women.
He takes pleasure in the company of emancipated women.
He made women's education compulsory. He made literacy rates rise. He made schools open to everyone.
To make a modern nation, all Turkey must be sent to school.
Ataturk also industrialized his country. Under his watch, the industrial sector saw a sharp increase, and his liberal foreign policies built a close relationship with the West, which paved the way for Turkey to join the NATO alliance in 1952.
We know that Ataturk succeeded because for decades it was a modern, secular Western country like he wanted it to be.
Ataturk is dictator so that Turkey may never again have a dictator.
Now you have President Erdogan. President Erdogan is going in literally the opposite direction. He wants to make the country much more openly religious. He wants to get rid of a lot of what Ataturk had done.
But how does a religious, conservative leader acquire so much power in a secular country? To understand this, you have to know what happened to Turkey after Ataturk's death. For 5 decades, the country was constantly in a state of upheaval. Ataturk had given the military the responsibility of keeping Turkey secular, and they did so by staging coups in 1960, 71, 80, and again in 1997. While the interventions were meant to keep Turkey democratic, the instability left the country in poor shape.
In the 90s and even to the early 2000s, Turkey had completely stale economy. The GDP growth had slowed, unemployment was very high. It was seen as a very corrupt country, the government didn't function.
Enter Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He was the mayor of Istanbul from 1994 to 97. 2 years later, he was arrested for a public reading of a politically charged Islamic poem by a Turkish nationalist. Turkey was still a majority Muslim country, and his arrest made him popular with many who felt oppressed by years of the secular military rule. After a short jail sentence, he formed a moderately conservative political party, the AKP, which went on to win a landslide victory in the 2002 elections, and he became Prime Minister of Turkey. Erdogan went on to pull the country out of poverty by giving more opportunities to Turkish entrepreneurs and expanding access to foreign markets. This led to a sharp rise in the GDP, and inflation plummeted. Turkey's success even prompted efforts to join the EU. This all made Erdogan wildly popular.
It was like he came onto a boat that was listing and taking on water, and he managed to get the water out of the boat and make the boat sail straight again. So for many years you could see why a man like this would be as powerful as he became. Then he went too far.
Over the next 10 years, Turkey continued to grow economically, but Erdogan started pushing more Islamist and authoritarian policies. He was quoted saying that he did not believe men and women were equal, and that women were meant to be mothers. His government also began arresting protesters and journalists under the guise of anti-terrorism laws. This stirred unrest in Turkey's more liberal urban areas. In 2013, there was a small, peaceful demonstration in Istanbul's Gezi Park to protest Erdogan's plans to reconstruct military barracks that would include a shopping center and a mosque. Seeing the demonstration as opposition, Erdogan sent in riot police to remove the protesters, which quickly attracted more protesters.
It got bigger and bigger because it was a proxy. It morphed from being a protest over a park to being a protest against Erdogan, against how religious he was becoming, and it got violent. Previously, he had not been a brutal ruler. After this, he became a brutal one.
Erdogan began removing Ataturk's secular laws more aggressively. He ended the ban on wearing headscarves, tightened restrictions on alcohol sales, and freed mosques from government control. Then in 2014, Erdogan was elected president, which in Turkey is a ceremonial role with little real power. But that didn't put an end to the arrests made across the country, which indicated that Erdogan was still in charge.
And there were two groups of people who were terrified by this. One, the kind of secular Turks who looked back to Ataturk and said, "The hell's happening to our country?" The other was the military, and they were the ones, again, who believed that their core mission in life was to keep Turkey secular and that he was a threat.
So in July 2016, they staged a coup, and it almost worked. There was just one problem. The military couldn't get the public support this time. Erdogan had found a new way to reach his supporters.
I want to encourage my people to the streets and invite them to the airports. And together, as people gather, show them by letting them come with their tanks to see what they are going to do it right there to the people.
Erdogan had this amazing moment where he used FaceTime on his iPhone to kind of rally the country and say, defend the country, defend us against the military. Come Turks, come to me, come help rally around me. And it worked. You had secular Turks for the first time in years defend Erdogan. You had religious Turks literally stream from mosques into the streets to fight the military. The military overstepped. You had Turkish F-16s fire rockets and missiles at parliament. Turkish tanks fired at people in the streets. That was very effective for him.
Erdogan emerged from the fighting more popular than ever and ramped up his purge of the opposition. More than 100,000 journalists, academics, military officers, and politicians have been arrested since the coup attempt. Tens of thousands remain in detention. This brings us to the recent referendum, which follows Erdogan's post-coup popularity. He set it in motion to acquire more power and to make it permanent. But the vote was much closer than it was anticipated, suggesting that much of the country wants to hold on to the secular Turkey created by Ataturk, and they're willing to fight for it.
But I do think you're going to have the inevitable tension of a president who believes he's entitled to more power, taking more and more of it, and what remains a somewhat secular country that isn't comfortable with giving him that power. Do those tensions play out politically and in court, or do those play out in the streets? If it's actual fighting and violence, then what we know of as a democratic Turkey is over.
Quite a situation. and it helps account for why Turkey is moving in the direction that it is, closer to Russia and further away from the West and from NATO. It took many years for the Japanese to admit its atrocities and war crimes against the Koreans. It's still not really formally done so concerning the massacre at Nanking in China or its atrocities against the people of the Philippines. It took a long time. Japan likes to think that the world began the first day MacArthur established the new Japan. Germany was more forthcoming about its war crimes because of Konrad Adenauer. It took the Roman Catholic Church 500 years to acknowledge the Spanish Inquisition even happened, and when it did, it only apologized for the actions of, quote-unquote, its sons, certain Catholics who did it, ignoring the fact that it was an institutional policy of the Roman Catholic Church itself. Well, Turkey plays that game long. It has never accepted what it has done to the Armenians in the Armenian Holocaust. Neither has it accepted what has happened to the Greek population of coastal Turkey. But the antics of the Erdogan government against Armenian Christians have catapulted the issue of religious freedom to a new height in Turkey. 6 churches that had been confiscated by Erdogan's government. 6 Christian churches. The churches are litigating in court, but the court is Islamicized and politicized. What chance will they have? Again, unless there are Christian boycotts of Turkey, unless there are Western boycotts. I personally, some time ago, stopped leading our tours of the 7 churches of Revelation simply because I would not support the Turkish economy. I met with local believers in the area of Selçuk, near the city of Izmir, which was Smyrna in the scripture, and at the port city of Kusidisi, and I found out what was happening. Nobody was, of course, saying anything. The media will never say anything. The media never says anything unless it can say something against Israel or against evangelical Christians, saved Christians. Australia is having a referendum on the issues of same-sex marriage. Whether to redefine it as same-sex or not, a Christian church in Brisbane was upholding its conviction that marriage is heterosexual. Homosexuals and lesbians had a protest, and a lesbian has made a charge that as they were blocking entrance into the church premises, and a vehicle's being allowed to enter into the church parking lot, a quote-unquote Christian tried to run her over. If she was blocking the way and preventing people from going to church and she had gotten run over, that would have been her fault. Not that I say she should have been targeted or flattened, but it would have been her fault, putting herself deliberately in harm's way to prevent people from going to church because she doesn't agree with their position on marriage. This is not peaceful protest. What would happen if Christians protested outside of a homosexual or lesbian nightclub? But the media took her side and reported it as if there was some kind of an assault by Christians on a lesbian activist. The Australian media is among the most biased and left-wing in the world. There are good and fair Australian journalists such as Andrew Bolt. But Australian TV, Australian broadcasting is extremely biased and extremely left-wing, even more than the BBC and CNN and MSNBC in certain respects. Again, we have the silence of the media of Christians in the Maldives. They have very few rights, but their rights are being taken away. 1/3 of all lawyers in those islands have been suspended from their legal right to practice law for signing a petition, 56 of them in all, calling for the government to review its policy towards Christian rights. It is illegal for a Muslim to become a Christian. Islam can be propagated in Britain, America, wherever, but that Christianity is propagated in an Islamic country, that's a crime, an arrestable crime. People have been tortured. In 1998, the government arrested and tortured Christians. The possibility of being arrested for even having a Christian Bible is very real in the Maldives. But the media remains silent. All of these things, natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes in Mexico, the Caribbean, taking place at the same time Mr. Trump is giving his speech in the United Nations, meeting with Mr. Netanyahu. All of these actions by Turkey, aligning itself with Russia and with radical Islam. All of these things. What do we make of it? Well, there's only one thing we can make of it. Read the Olivet Discourse. Read Luke 21. Read Matthew 24. Read Mark 13. When you see these things happening, lift up your head. Your redemption draweth near. That has been This Week in Prophecy. My name is Jacob Prasch, coming to you this week from Los Angeles, California, in the USA. God bless you and your families. May many come to know the Lord Jesus this week. And may God bless President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu. Thank you so much.